For 1,500 years, from the time that Moses led the sons of Israel out of Egypt until the time of the cross, God had the people of Israel, not the whole world, but the people of Israel, living under law. We know it as the Ten Commandments, the Mosaic Law, the Covenant of Law. Those were the different ways that the Bible actually described that period of time. Abraham had not been under it. In fact, we have looked at that in other studies before, where Moses actually says in the book of Deuteronomy, God didn't give this law to your fathers. He didn't give it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He gave it to you. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were not under the law. And you and I are not under law. Romans chapter 6, verse 14, just for one of many statements to this effect. For sin, it's a reference, we'd say, to the qualities of sin. It's probably pointing at the sin nature, but just the qualities of sin, shall not be a master or a lord over you, for you're not under law, but under grace. Now, the Greek does not actually say the law and the grace here. It's just law. You're not under law anymore, whether it's Mosaic law or other laws. Many Christians develop laws that aren't the Mosaic law. They're not even a copy of the Mosaic law or the Ten Commandments. They're just, we call them standards sometimes. And we say that we are under those laws. And that's what we use to govern our Christian life. But that's not the case. Our lives are to be governed by grace. And many Christians, the minute they look at this, they think, oh, you think anything goes. And we've talked about this before, that living under grace means you live in light of the grace of God. You don't sin it up because you're under grace. You actually are saying there are things that are consistent with the provisions of grace and things that aren't consistent. If you have to look at that, I'd encourage you to go to Titus chapter 2, verses 11 and following, and you can see that grace, not law, is training us on how to live today. The reason I start with this is because we're going to look at a statement over in Galatians chapter 5 today that some people are going to use to suggest that you and I can lose our salvation. And we're going to see that it is a misunderstanding of what Paul is saying. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we put in over in Galatians chapter 5. I want to actually go back up to verse 1, and he says, it was for freedom that Christ has freed us. Therefore, stand or keep standing firm, and do not be subject again to the yoke of slavery. A good place to go would be to Acts chapter 15, where Paul talks about the yoke, or Peter talks about the yoke, and he says, let's not put a yoke on the neck of the disciples, which even we nor our fathers were able to do. So they're talking about putting believers under the yoke of the law. Look, Paul tell you that if you yourselves are circumcised, that was the first step to putting yourselves under law, Christ will be of no benefit. There's no, you don't get anything. If you're turning this to circumcision in the law, you're not enjoying the benefit of what it means to be in Christ. And I testify again to every man who has himself circumcised, he is obligated to keep the whole law. Then we come to verse 4, and here's our verse. You have been, this is the 2020 edition of the New American Standard. They said, you have been severed from Christ. I went through a whole bunch of translations on this. We're going to come back to this word here in just a moment. But you are severed from Christ. You who are seeking to be justified or declared righteous by law, you have fallen from grace. There it is. You fell from grace. And people look at that meaning, well, you lost your salvation. But that is not at all what Paul is saying. Paul is saying you aren't living by grace. Rather than living to live in grace, you have to live in who God says you are in Christ. You have to have your mind set to who you are in Christ. And you are not doing that when you turn to law. When you turn to law, the book of Galatians is very plain that you are focusing on activity down here, and you are going about accomplishing those things by your flesh, by your own human efforts. And therefore, you are fallen from grace. You aren't living by grace. You're not living in who God says you are in Christ. You're living by your own human efforts under law. So with that, I want to go back up and look at this word up here that the New American Standard translates, you are severed. Some Bibles say cut off. But it's this verb over here, katargeo. Now this particular Greek word is based on the root verb argeo or argos. If you know what argon is what's considered a neutral gas, an inert gas, and they put it in windows because it doesn't transfer heat and cold between the two panes of glass in a double paned window. Maybe you didn't know that. I had to learn that when I put windows in my house a number of years ago. But that's the base of this word, argo or argeo, to render or for something to be idle. That's what that means. This particular form, katargeo, means to act on something so that you render it idle. Let's take a look at just two passages that'll illustrate this. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 28. It says, God chose the things that the world considers insignificant and contemptible, what is regarded as nothing, to render useless. Now, this is William Mounce's translation of the New Testament. I've chose this because I really think this renders this really well. It's a great illustration of this word here. Renders useless the things that are. In other words, he's taking these people and these situations that the world looks down its nose at and say, that's nothing, they're insignificant. But what that does is it renders useless the things that seem to be important. They seem to be somethings, or the people who seem to be somebodies. Renders useless. That's a good translation of this verb, katargeo. I'm going to go over to Romans chapter 6, verse 6. We know that this shouldn't be old self, I would say the old man. That's who you and I were as people, not believers, as people in Adam before we believed the gospel. We were in Adam, condemned with Adam. So he says, our old man was then crucified with him. I was crucified, but what was crucified is who I was at that time in Adam. So that the body of sin would be, notice, rendered powerless. What did we have over here? Rendered useless. Over here, rendered powerless. So that we would no longer be enslaved to the sin. Literally, the sin. We're referring to the sin nature. So when he says rendered powerless, he's using that same verb, katargeo. He's using the same kind of form, except it's saying it is rendered powerless, whereas in Galatians 5, it's you are rendered powerless, or you are rendered, what was the one we had over here? Useless. I think those are good illustrations. And what he says is, I would translate, you have been rendered powerless or rendered useless away from Christ. You who are seeking to be justified by the law, you have fallen from grace. This is actually a very important verse for the Christian life, because what it tells you is that when you as a believer turn to the law, you can be very busy. You can be super religious. You can be doing all kinds of things that maybe your pastor tells you should do. Maybe you read it in a book. Maybe the people in your church culture, the friends you hang out with, they tell you these are all the things you need to do if you want to be a great Christian. You need to be doing these things. And they do all that, and you start to do those things to be okay with them so that you can check off your list that you are doing the good things you're supposed to be doing. And when you do that, in reality, the power of that word is not that you're severed from Christ. It's that you are rendered idle. You are made useless. You are made powerless. You think you're busy. You're doing all kinds of stuff. But from God's point of view, you're just spinning your wheels. You are not doing anything that God really wants. And these are believers doing this. That's the whole point. They're believers that are doing this. And they've fallen from grace because rather than operating and living by grace in Christ, they're focusing on life down here in this world. In many Christians, in fact, I would say, maybe if you're listening to this and you struggle with the issue of eternal security, a lot of believers I've talked with that don't believe in eternal security, they spend a lot of time trying to still be good enough. Well, maybe that's not you, but I find a lot of them do. And they actually are really putting themselves in this exact verse because they are not operating by grace. They're operating by a law system that says I cross this line and I lose my salvation. If they were operating by grace, they would say, hey, I'm in Christ and nothing changes that. And therefore, they would focus on who they are in Christ, and they wouldn't render themselves idle by trying to be justified by keeping some sort of a law system, and a law that they created, their church created, their pastor created, other people, whatever it is, you get the idea. People create law systems all the time. I've talked with the people in our church just recently about the fact that every church creates a church culture. And there's some things of those church cultures I hope are good, but it's really easy for us to develop standards in church cultures by which we just say that guy's a mess and that guy's a mess, and those people over there, they're doing it right and they're using the right translation and they sing the right kind of music. Those people over there, however, no, they're singing the wrong kind of music, and they don't use the right translations, and while they don't dress appropriately for church, and it's stuff that were never issues. We make issues and standards that are not, they're not the gauge of whether your Christian life is right or not. And so whether it has to do with literally getting circumcised, literally trying to keep the Mosaic law, or whether it's creating a law system of your own, or subjecting yourself to a law system within some sort of a church or Christian type culture, when we do that, we actually are becoming idle, powerless, useless. Like I said, we may be very busy. We say, man, do you know how many Bible studies that person teaches every week? Do you know how many verses that person memorizes? Do you know how often that person gets up and shares a testimony at church? And fill in the blank. And man, they know this and that. But they're doing all of that out of their own efforts to meet a standard. And in reality, that word that's translated severed, no, they're actually useless and powerless. So this is not a threat to our salvation. This is not a verse that says we lose our salvation. It's telling us what happens to us when we turn to law. Don't turn to law. Live by grace. Live who you are in Christ. And just live in light of that. That's what God calls us to do. As always, take this truth, relate to it. This is an encouragement to remember who we are in Christ, to set our minds there, that in Him we might have a good day. And as always, thank you for joining me.